I'm Louise Nicola, and this is the Neuro Experience.
70% of people watching this will experience cognitive decline, but you say that's a choice, not a destiny. In fact, you worked with Formula One drivers whose brains process information at 200 miles per hour, and you discovered something that changes everything we know about the brain. You say that most people are literally poisoning their brains by treating them like trucks instead of Formula One cars. What does that mean?
I guess I should start by saying that right now, it would be unfair to say that cognitive decline is a choice because most people don't know that they have a huge amount of control over that. And there are also factors that influence cognitive trajectory over the lifespan that people don't necessarily have control over. But as a society, say, we could say that the majority of cognitive decline is basically optional were we to put everything in place that would change the factors that affect cognitive function. What people traditionally think is that as we get older, we're just destined for our function to decline. And that's true for physical function, it's true for cognitive function. But we've actually known for several decades now that the average, and by average, I mean, there are many different ways to measure an average, but by median, so like the middle, or actually for most people, cognitive function can stay relatively stable from your 50s into your 80s and maybe even further. This is not what people expect. What they expect is you might have seen some of these graphs and you'll see them on social media, you might see them in scientific papers where you have on one, the y-axis, the side, you have cognitive function of some kind, and there's lots of different types of cognitive function that we can measure, and then age along the bottom, and you just see this essentially steady decline from your 20s or 30s, and you assume that that's what happens to everybody. But that's actually just, again, an average. It's the mean average of everybody in the population. But most people can stay relatively stable while a few people do experience decline, and that drags down the average. So it's very different to think, what is my cognitive function going to be in 30 years' time versus what is the overall average population's cognitive function going to be. Looking at the different factors that influence cognitive function, there are a huge number of things that we have control over. This is relevant to Formula One drivers, just like it is relevant to the rest of us, because it's related to how we use our brains, how we then recover from cognitive stimuli, which are a really important part of developing and maintaining cognitive function, just like physical activity and physical stimuli are really important for maintaining physical function. So then how we recover from that, so sleep, nutrition plays a huge role, as do a whole bunch of other things that we might expose ourselves to or be exposed to, which actually means that we have a huge amount of control over the factors that influence cognitive function across our lifespan. But the first thing we need to realize is that we do have control, because then we may actually do something about it.
Why don't we define for everyone what cognitive functions are? I say this often, and I think that a lot of people are like, does that mean thinking? Let's explain what that is and the difference between cognition and the actual structural part of the brain.
The majority of neuroscience focuses on the physical structure of the brain. And historically, that has been, how did this brain look under a microscope after this person died? More recently, it's been, how does it look on an MRI scan, or a variety of other scans so we can look at different structures and functions of the brain in real time. Though cognitive functions do then map onto that structure, how the brain looks under a microscope is almost completely unrelated to how that brain functioned in real life, because
like the neurons, how they're cell bodies, all of that.
Yeah, so you can look at so particularly if we're talking about cognitive decline, we might think about proteins that accumulate in the brain as we get older, like amyloid and tau, and that tells us something about that brain, but it tells us actually quite little about how that person was in the world and how their brain functioned doing the things that they wanted to do every day. And we've spent decades trying to map these two pieces together, but we still don't really know fully how the structure of the brain maps onto how that brain functions in real life. And this is important because each of our brains is completely different. right? And does completely different things. It's been exposed to completely different things. And it's, we're still trying to reconcile how those things map onto each other. But we can look at the structure in different parts of the brain. We can think about, the frontal lobe at the front, which is, often think about how that's related to executive function or decision making. We can think about parts like the hippocampus, which is sort of in the middle, kind of slightly underneath, kind of near your ears, which is very important for memory. We can think about the back of the brain, the occipital lobe is very important for vision, as well as various other things, the cerebellum, all the way at the back, which does emotional control, motor control. So when we talk about cognitive function, I talk about it quite broadly, mainly because each of us wants our brains to do slightly different things. And so part of it is very personal, though there are also some core features that we might all want. Like, we want to be able to make decisions in the moment when we have to. We want to be able to remember important things and, our family members. We want to be able to sort of react and respond to the environment as things happen around us. And these are some of the core basic functions of the brain that we can measure. But when we sort of talk about cognitive function more broadly, we can talk about those sort of individual core features and different things you might do with your lifestyle, preferentially affect different cognitive functions. But I'm also just thinking about brain health overall, which is some measure of, is your brain doing what you want it to do when you want it to do it?
Yeah, or performing even better, because those cognitive functions decline, and there's a reason, may decline, okay? But there's a number of reasons, factors that may decline. For a woman, it may be hormonal, it could be genetic, or you could be hit in the head, if you're an NFL player. There's so many reasons as to why your cognitive functions may decline. But what you're setting out to prove and educate the world on is the fact that it doesn't, or like we've got more agency than okay, I love that. Why don't we move into this world of nootropics and supplementation? Because I think that's where most people think, what I'm seeing online is like, how can I take this supplement to make me think better, make me more sharper? There's what's the Limitless? There's a Limitless drug. There's a movie about it. And we all think as a society, if I just take this supplement, maybe it's choline, acetylcholine, if I just take this, it'll make me think faster. So when people spend $500 a month on supplements and nootropics for their brain, you're saying they're literally flushing their money down the water. Is that correct?
It's hard for me to say that, and I wouldn't necessarily say that all those things are a waste of money, but I would say that the vast majority are not necessary. Many of the supplements that might work tend to be core basic nutrients that the brain needs that you might not be getting enough of from the diet. Things like B vitamins, vitamin D, omega-3s. If you're not consistently getting them from the diet, or you do a blood test and you see that your levels are maybe not where you would want them to be, and we know sort of cutoffs as they relate to risk of cognitive decline and dementia, then I think supplementing with those can make a lot of sense. But everything else, the majority of supplements don't have a huge amount of evidence behind them. And the core functions of the brain are much better supported by manipulating lifestyle and the environment as much as we're able to. So physical activity, for example, and there are many different types of physical activity, and different types of physical activity affect different parts of the brain and different functions of the brain. And so the evidence there is much greater than, say, for most supplements. But I understand that people are looking for an answer. The problem is that for some of these supplements, those that do, have been shown to affect cognitive function in a beneficial way, what they're often doing is they're supporting one aspect of cognitive function at the expense of others. So the brain doesn't just improve everything at the same time, right? When you're using one part of the brain, then other parts of the brain sort of decrease their activity. And one of the best examples of this is the broad category of stimulants. So you can think about caffeine, but they've done similar studies with the stimulants that they might use for ADHD, things like methylphenidate. And what you see is that certain, very basic types of cognitive functions, so particularly reaction time. Sometimes you do a test called psychomotor vigilance, which is a way to measure reaction time. You will often see improvements in that kind of very basic cognitive function with stimulants. But what you then see at the same time, partly it's because you become overstimulated, and partly just because of the sort of the different parts of the brain that are being activated. You can see decreases in performance in more complex cognitive functions like working memory or response inhibition, like executive function and decision making. So often we're taking these supplements and we think, oh, I'm just going to improve my brain function. But you may be improving one part of function at the expense of another. Now, if that means that you can do the thing that you need to do better at the time, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you shouldn't think that you're sort of overall just improving everything at the same time.